Chapter 8. Victoria Station. Victoria. Victoria. Sade repeated the name to herself of the station where Mrs. Bankole said they would get off. Buildings, streets, roofs, telephone wires, trees, cloudy sky and now dirty tunnel walls hurtled by outside the train window. Inside the compartment, the passengers reminded Sade of a page in her children's encyclopedia, illustrating people from all around the world. A map above the opposite seat showed a long blue line, looped at one end with a picture of an aeroplane. Little squares and circles, each with a name, were dotted along its length. So many different stations. Another map showed many different coloured lines weaving in and out of each other, and dozens of other stations. It would be so easy to get lost. Why hadn't Uncle Dele come to meet them in this gigantic city? Sade felt her stomach encircled and twisted by a web of ever-tightening wire. The trouble at customs had clearly upset Mrs. Bankole. She was also clearly annoyed not to find their uncle at the airport. Now she'd have to take the children to Uncle Dele's college. There'd also been no sign of a Mr. Bankole. Mrs. Bankole did not mention him again, but began to grouse about having to drag all her baggage around London. It seemed that she meant the children too. Waiting for the train, a little distance from the other passengers, she'd whispered a strong warning. On no account were the children to tell anyone her name, ever, even if they were made to admit it, and admit that they'd entered the country by pretending to be someone else's children. She threatened that if they ever mentioned her name, the agent who had helped them in Lagos would hear about it. Then he would never help their father, and Papa would not be able to join them. Throughout the journey, Mrs. Bankole was silent, except when they changed trains from the map's blue line to the green, and she told them to stay close. At Victoria, Sade helped push the large maroon suitcase onto the platform, then hurried to keep up as Mrs. Bankole pulled the case behind her. Femi tagged further behind with the brown hold-all. "Be quick! Those airport people made us late," Mrs. Bankole said forcefully. "I have to meet someone before we take the 6:30 to your uncle." Sade noticed that Mrs. Bankole no longer called them Yemi and Ade. Mrs. Bankole steered her way through the crowd, upstairs, escalators, and along winding corridors to the ticket machine. A metal bar lifted to let each of them out. "Hurry now!" Mrs. Bankole rushed on, leading them into an area of shops and stalls, all under a vast roof. Turning the corner, they almost tripped over a young man, sharing a sleeping bag with a dog. Both the man and the dog had narrow, pointed faces and startled eyes. "Can you spare any change?" the man asked. Mrs. Bankole ignored him. People were hurrying in all directions, while others stood staring up at an enormous notice board. Mrs. Bankole headed towards the cafe. "Oh, he's still there," she sounded relieved. "Wait here, you two." A large, heavily built man was just coming out of the cafe entrance, making his way between the tables outside. Mrs. Bankole hurried towards him. Before he had even opened his mouth, he looked fierce. His face was square, with his hair cut as level as a table, descending to a flattened U shape on his forehead. "Where have you been? I had to ring the airport so many times. Your plane landed nearly 4 hours ago," he said angrily. Sade could tell from his accent he was Nigerian. Was this Mr. Bankole? "The problem was in customs. It's not my fault," Mrs. Bankole retorted. "We were stopped." "We?" Mrs. Bankole hesitated. "Let me get these children something to drink first," she said. "Then I'll explain." The man stared at them, scowling. "Children? Whose children?" "I said that I will explain in a minute. What have you got yourself into? Are you mad?" Mrs. Bankole grabbed Sade's hand and thrust some coins into it. She pointed to the corner inside the cafe. "Get something. I'll come soon." Without giving them time to reply, she pushed them through the door and hurried back outside. Femi pulled a face and made his way to the counter. "Coke, please, and one of those," he said to a pink-cheeked woman with a white cap. He pointed to a square of chocolate cake. "The same, please," added Sade. As soon as the words were out, she realised she should first check that the 5 coins in her hand would be enough. But before she could say anything, the white-capped woman had turned her back and was already pressing a lever on the machine and briskly pouring their drinks. "4.20, she said, sweeping 2 plates of chocolate cake onto the counter. Hiding her nervousness, Sade offered all 5 coins and watched the pink fingers dance across the buttons on the till. Without looking at the children, the woman slapped 4 silver coins back onto the counter. They carried their drinks and plates to the table. When Mamma or Papa had taken them to eat out at home, the waiters often talked and joked with them. "Machine lady," Sade whispered to Femi, but he was too busy burrowing into his cake to reply. Outside the cafe, Mrs. Bancole and Mr. Bad Temper had moved a little further away from the cafe door and were standing in front of a flower stall. If this was Mr. Bancole, he didn't look at all happy to be seeing his wife again. Sade couldn't hear what they were saying, but from their expressions and hands it appears they were still arguing. At times Mrs. Bancole glanced uneasily across at the cafe. "Sade," Femi had finished his cake and most of his drink when he paused to look up at his sister. "Why do you think Uncle Dele didn't come to the airport?" His voice was small. The criss-cross wire around Sade's stomach tightened. Perhaps the panicky fluttering showed on her face because Femi quickly changed the subject. "Let me see their money," he said, stretching out his hand. Sade passed him a small silver coin. She examined one herself, running her forefinger around the edges. It was almost round but had little corners. "She's their queen," said Femi. On the other side was a rose with a crown. "It says 20 pence, said Sade, "so we've got 80. I'm sure she'll want them back." But when Sade looked up in the direction of the flower stall, the place where Mrs. Bancole had been standing, with Mr. Bad Temper, it was empty.